Can you hear me okay in the back? Yes. Okay, perfect. So thank you very much, Kim, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to be the second speaker in the Got Anthopology speaker series. Well, my talk description is somewhat thick with academic language, the marketization of morals, commodification of activism, neoliberalism. The aim of these talks, and my talk tonight, is really to make some of the topics that we're bringing to you a little bit more informative, a little bit more accessible, and we're really hoping to sort of generate discussions with these topics that we're presenting. So at the end, after I present some of my ideas about the possibility of being an ethical consumer, I'm really hoping to turn it over to you and get some ideas about your thoughts on this, to take some of your questions and some of your comments about this. So think about this as we're going through this talk. So before we completely escape the rigmarole of academia, we have to be sure we're correctly defining our terms. And for the purposes of my talk, some of these terms are what, right off the bat, make this issue sort of problematic. These are some of the issues with the idea of ethical consumption, is it's something that truly is rather hard to define. So the second part of this consumption part of the definition is the easiest. We're really talking about the purchase of goods. So that's very simple. But it's the ethical side that causes a little bit more distress. It's more problematic for us. Because how do we define that which is morally correct? How do we know when something is honorable? What does that mean, and to whom? Who gets to decide on these labels that we place on consumer products? So I thought we could introduce a definition from another anthropologist, James Carrier, who some of you might be familiar with, to help tease this idea out a little further. But still, this is problematic. So James Carrier takes the definition a little bit further than does the Oxford Dictionary, as anthropologists like to do. He adds a few more words. But he really talks about ethical consumption at a very personal and individual level. So this is something to keep in mind throughout the talk, because a big part of this new form of social movement, this ethical consumption, has a lot to do with the individual. It's really a personal response to a larger situation. Carrier also talks about the fact that this form of consumption has a lot to do with the way that goods are produced. So this is interesting, because when we're thinking about ethical consumption, there seems to be much more to it than just the way goods are manufactured. That's a huge part of it. I'm sure that sweatshops immediately sprung to people's minds when we're thinking about this very topic. But what about materials and products that we're purchasing and consuming? What about the use of these different things? What if they're harmful to people or the purchaser? I mean, we have to think about these other items as well. And of course, we still have this problematic aspect of what is ethical criteria? What does this mean? So to begin, I wanted to show a few examples of items, that are often talked about as if they're part of this whole ethical consumption realm, pretty easy and don't need to be critically unpacked very far. So goods that help fund research are one such example that really has become very popular nowadays. And the Pink Ribbon campaign is such a huge example of this. I mean, if you go into any Shoppers Drug Mart or store that sells beauty products, you're sure to stumble across this pink ribbon. So you need to purchase these kind of personal health products. Arguably, we all need to use soap or shampoo or conditioner. Maybe not. I do. So if you're going to make this purchase anyway, why not buy something that supports something bigger and better? Why not put your money towards women's health research, the breast cancer campaign? I mean, this seems like a no-brainer. But when you're supporting Dove, you're also supporting Unilever, which sells Axe body spray. It's one of their huge and very well-selling products. So Axe, as many people who are familiar with their commercial and advertising know, they have really been critiqued a lot over the years because their products are said to really sexualize women. So this is sort of a tame example of some of the ads they have out there, but this is something to keep in mind. So the same person who's buying Dove and really trying to support women's health and feel good about being a woman might object to this idea of supporting the same kind of product. At least we know that Unilever loves women's breasts. So another big example that we hear about a lot is organic products. So organic fruits and vegetables are what often springs to mind, I'm sure. But also organic material and clothing has become really in fashion right now. And again, we have this idea that we need to buy clothes. When we go out into the world, we need to cover up. We're living in this crazy world that we have to put on t-shirts. So again, why not make a purchase that's a little bit better for the environment? Why not buy organic cotton? we know we're doing something really good. But the largest producer and seller of organic cotton right now also happens to be H&M, a company that anybody following these kind of news stories knows has been called out a lot in the last couple of years for really poor working conditions overseas. So again, we see it's not that simple. One more example. And this one's kind of the poster child of ethical consumption. When I think about ethical products and people making ethical buying decisions, I mean, a hybrid really springs to mind pretty immediately. And the Prius is the poster child of this movement. It's the planet's favorite hybrid. But again, it's not that simple. It's Toyota that owns the Prius, and also one of the biggest gas-guzzling cars on the market right now. So these are just a few examples to highlight the fact that this ethical consumption movement is not as easy, as natural, and easy to figure out as one might assume. I gather since you're all here tonight, this is something that people have thought about and realize that it's not easy as what meets the eye, but I just wanted to get us all thinking about some of these topics. So tonight's talk will really explore how ethical consumption as a form of activism has become very much a common practice. I will talk a little bit about what the current political and economic landscape contributes to this way of thinking, how this thinking has evolved over time, and how this idea of the consumer activist has really flourished over the past few years, and really unpack some of these various problems associated with ethical consumption. So I've talked about a few, but we'll take it further. One of the biggest problems, of course, is the fact that ethical consumption can really feed back into these systems that shoppers are aiming to fight with their purchasing decisions. And lastly, because I realize this all sounds very negative and like we're fighting a losing battle, some recommendations for things that we can keep in mind or try to do going forward if we leave here thinking that this is all kind of hopeless. I hope that's not what you leave feeling. So first, let's take a look at the current political and economic landscape in which we're living, which I would define as, and many people would define as a time of global neoliberal capitalism. So broadly, this is an economic, a group of economic policies and really ideals that promote things like free markets, free trade. It's very much about the individual, private property rights, and entrepreneurship. The role of the state within this broader economic system is really minimalized, as the state is said to prop up the markets. It's about free markets, it's about keeping the markets functioning. The state is no longer what's meant to provide social support or help for its citizens. We should be relying on the market to do that. Within the system, citizens have really been reimagined or reconceptualized as entrepreneurs, as companies of one. We can get out there, we can make change. It's really up to us as individuals. Don't worry about the collective, we all have the power to do this. So it's really no wonder then that within this larger framework, this idea of the consumer activist has really thrived. We can make changes on our own. We can work within the economic sphere. We don't need the state to help us. So with this in mind, then let's turn to what the contemporary activist discourse looks like nowadays. So commodity activism has really become a movement that exists within the economic sphere. So as I said, the state's role is really seen as being minimalized, and there's this real turn to the markets to help make change. So social justice has been really repositioned as something that can be achieved through ethical or responsible consumer choices. There's this message and this idea that the markets act as a signaling device. So what that means is through our market transactions, we are signaling some kind of preference or some kind of desire. And in theory, at least, we're signaling our values. So this is a trend that has really permeated the activist discourse. It's this idea that change can be effected in this way. It's become very, very popular. In fact, a Statistics Canada survey found just 2 years ago that among people who self-identify as activists, this is one of the leading ways that they're making changes through their consumption patterns. So I have this weird chart up here that I realize is not very clear, but this is speaking to a pattern that's happening right now in Canada. Since the turn of the most recent century, so the 2000s and beyond, political action and political activity has remained pretty flat. And in fact, in younger generations, it has started to decline. The only area that bucks this trend is ethical consumption, which again, people have self-identified as a form of political action. This has important implications, because when consumerism becomes a form of activism, when people start using their wallets instead of their voice to try and affect change, it really seems to reinforce the status quo. It lets us know that the market is a viable option for making change in the world. But this move towards the consumer citizen is not altogether new. As I said, it does seem to be more prevalent than ever before. It's a trend that really seems to be on the increase. But it's been around for a while. Post-war affluence in the United States has really ushered in this idea of supporting the country through consumerism. This is a narrative that continues and seems to really be strengthening in recent years. So, as some people who in this room might recall, after September 11th, this was a message that Bush really pushed. Get out there, flood the economy with American dollars. We can re-strengthen with buying power. This message also came through in 2006 from this very same president who said to the American public during the presidential address, "I encourage you to go shopping more." I mean, that's pretty in your face. And this is not a Republican-only message. As recently as last fall, President Barack Obama encouraged people to go out and shop to support small businesses. He and his family were doing the same. At least he's buying books. You can see what side we're on. So the bipartisan top-down message is clear. Be a good citizen. Consume to support your country. So just as the consumer citizen is not altogether new, neither is the consumer activist. There have been sweatshops or factories that had working conditions that can be accurately described as sweatshops around since the 19th century. Many of these were set up in the Western world. The US had a large number of these factories, as did England, and other places that you don't naturally think of when you think of sweatshops. So there was a lot of workers' movements that pushed back against this form of production and were in fact victorious. There was a ton of workers' rights battles won, and there was caps put on working hours and minimum wage laws were put in place. But as we know, this mode of production has not disappeared. It simply picked up and moved across the borders. We still know that sweatshops are in operation, and more so than ever before. They're just operating parts of the world that have not yet won their workers have not yet been victorious in the battle against these. So this movement, this anti-sweatshop movement, really gained steam again in the 20th century. Really in the 80s and 90s, it reignited again. But the movement in those days was less about these big workers' movements and more about collective action taken by activists who were boycotting. So boycotting was really big at that time. So people were just out and out refusing to buy from places that were creating goods and selling goods and factories that had these really terrible conditions that could be accurately described as sweatshops. But yet, these continue and still exist today. And in fact, well, there seems to be a new form of movement, so there's sort of a third wave of pushback against this movement, which has come now in the form of consumer activism. These supply chains, the way that goods are produced through supply chains and commodity chains, really make this fight more relevant than ever before. So today, because of the way consumables are produced, pushbacks against this form of production really do seem more relevant than ever before. This form of production that exists, in which third parties are supplying most of the products that are sold across the world, a lot of these global consumables are manufactured, in places like the Global South, where, again, as I said, these worker rights movements have not been as successful, and wages remain very low, people are working long hours, and they can pump out a steady flow of global consumables that are used by people across the world for much less money. So we're continuing to protest against this form of movement, where we're just taking a different form. Yet these movements really seem more relevant today than ever before. According to the International Labor Rights Forum, between the year 2005 and 2012, more than 700 workers in Bangladesh factories died as a result of working conditions. So they were working in factories that had unsafe conditions, many of which collapsed or had fires, or they were injured so badly on the job that they died. So this is a pretty huge number. This is shocking when you think about how many people are killed as a direct result of working in a factory that's producing garments. These are clothes that we're buying. One of the main producers, or one of the main companies that uses this kind of production is H&M. So they've been very open about this. I mean, they were called out pretty drastically in the news, but they have admitted to the fact that they are in fact using these factories. Many of their factories have been implicated in these terrible fires and collapses of buildings. Yet H&M is a hugely successful company, and they're continuing to do very well. They're really doing a brisk business. They have more than 3,000 stores in over 50 markets of the world, and this is growing every year. They have said they're going to be making changes, so I don't want to come down too hard on them. They're aware of this problem. They say that they're working with some of the local workers' rights groups to try to make changes, but change is not coming fast enough. So look at this number. Look at the years here. And now look at this next line. Look at this jump. So they're making changes, but that number has more than doubled in the last year. There's been some really horrific fires. I'm sure that people have read about them in the news. So while H&M is talking about making changes, people are dying, really large numbers of people. So change isn't happening fast enough. Yet, the way that we're pushing back against this kind of production has really changed. So if this was 30 years ago, people would probably be boycotting. They would say, I refuse to buy from H&M until there's some sort of change made. But today it's different. The way that we push back is more reflective of our current political and global landscape. We're shopping instead. We're making a change by spending, which is really about individual action. It's about a personal choice. It's not about the collective anymore. But we are spending less. So I read these statistics, and I thought that this seemed pretty uplifting. So 40 years ago, we were spending over 10% of our household income on clothing and accessories. And in 2010, that number dropped. Not significantly, but it was still on a downward trend. So okay, maybe I'm wrong about this whole boycott shopping thing. Maybe we are spending less. Maybe we've decided we're not okay with so many people in Bangladesh dying in fires. But just because we're spending less is not really reflective of our actions. We're in fact buying more than ever before. Some statistics that came out last year indicated that Americans and Canadians buy an average of 64 items of clothing a year. That's on average. That is a huge number. To me, this seems crazy. And if that's the average, think about who's pushing that number up. So we're buying more than ever before and we're spending less, which again is reflective of the way supply chain capitalism works. We have access to more goods for a lower price. But why? Why are we shopping so much? Why are we buying 64 items of clothing a year? Well, for one thing, it feels good to buy. I mean, look at this lady. She's so happy. It's nice to shop. We like new things. We like to buy new outfits. Some of us like shoes. I am among those people. It's important to keep in mind because the majority of their employees are paid either minimum wage or just above minimum wage. The majority are not making a living wage, and the majority are employed as part-time workers. So this means that the majority of employees in the world's largest private employer, they don't have access to things like healthcare plans, to the benefits that you would receive as a salaried full-time worker, or to overtime pay because they're being kept on as part-time employees. And this ability to have access overtime pay is very important for low-wage earners. And another example that's closer to home, XL Foods, which might sound familiar to some people because they were in the news over the last few years for poor sanitation within their meat-producing factories. So this is Alberta beef. This is one of these other big buy local, buy Canadian beef, buy Alberta. But the Alberta government found when they were going into their factories after people started to get very ill, not before because deregulation is a big part of this industry, but when they started to investigate the circumstances that led to these poor sanitation procedures, they found that meat producers, such as XL Foods, tend to be working under very underregulated conditions. They're short-staffed, and workers are working very long shifts and expecting to produce a lot. So XL Foods at the time had their workers producing 2 million pounds of beef per day. So they're short-staffed, they're overworked, they're tired. It's no wonder that sanitation procedures possibly are slipping, and it's no wonder that employees are getting hurt. These are some of the places in which worker injury rates are extremely high. And this is